Now, if I would have told you that the Mets would have won 100 games and would be in the playoffs, if I told you that in April as a Mets fan, I think most of them would take that overall. But the situation that we find ourselves in after an incredibly disappointing, a frustrating, a very upsetting series against Atlanta is now the Mets sit in second place. They will be playing in the wild card game this Friday, Mets and Padres. I'm Sam Davis, your New York Mets beat reporter. I'm going to be taking you through a preview of that series. But before that, like I mentioned, a very frustrating series. I would like to recap and look at that, especially because there are some themes, some takeaways from that series that I think apply to the Mets and the Padres in the wild card. 175 days in first place, the New York Mets were. Before that Atlanta Braves series, of course, everything kind of just fell apart, getting swept. There's a couple big reasons as to why that is. The first reason, honestly, is those stars and those big players not stepping up when the time mattered the most. Starting at the pitching side of things, those two guys, we heard about them all year, Jacob deGrom and Max Scherzer. DeGrom went 6 innings. He did strike out 11, but gave up 3 homers, all on solo home runs. Meanwhile, Scherzer, 5 2/3, 4 runs. He gave up 2 home runs as well, just 4 strikeouts for Max Scherzer. And on the hitting side of things, the same thing is the truth in that those big guys, Alonso and Lindor, to name a couple, 5 for 23, 2 runs scored, and 0 RBIs. So between those kind of 4 main themes, those are players that, if you're the Mets, those are the guys you want to step up down the stretch in this big series, in basically a playoff series against Atlanta. They did not. That's definitely part of the reason why they lost and why they were swept in that series. Of course, not having Starling Marte in the lineup, that hurts a lot. That hurts the depth of the lineup. Just a lot of outs overall in this lineup between Francisco Alvarez, who just got called up, clearly not ready for that kind of stage, just obviously not in a position that he should be in. Getting those big at-bats late in the game. I think Buck made a couple questionable moves, keeping Alvarez in the game late, despite the fact that it was obvious that, he was a little overwhelmed by the stage, and I don't blame him, considering the fact that obviously he just came from Syracuse, was driving home, and had to come up and play in a massive series against Atlanta. And part of that is the rough injury, but bringing him up when you do, that's kind of a recipe for failure. Just a couple outs in the lineup that didn't make it as deep, obviously without Starling Marte. That hurts it as well. And the lack of power. I mean, that's been talked about with the New York Mets lineup all season long. They haven't had the opportunity, to kind of get those big hits at times. The Mets they out-hit the Braves 11-5 on Sunday. They lose that game. Each team had 8 hits in the game on Friday. The Mets lose that game. So they're getting guys on base, but not hitting with runners in scoring position, not getting that big power swing. And there were a couple home runs in that game, but not getting the majority of those power, lacking that power from the Mets lineup. That definitely hurt them as well. And like I mentioned a little bit earlier, Buck with some questionable moves. I thought Friday night, going to Tyler Mcneil out of the bullpen in the 7th inning, I thought it was a terrible move. To be honest, I thought it was a bonehead move. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I think it points to a problem maybe in the bullpen. That's something that they did not address at the trade deadline, and you throw, maybe some, blame onto Billy Epler for that, definitely as the GM at the trade deadline. However, there were guys, and there's Seth Lugo, there's Adam Ottavino. I don't care that Seth Lugo pitched back-to-back nights. He should be in that game in the 7th inning. Adam Ottavino and Edwin Diaz. Those are your 3 guys. Tyler Mcneil is a good starter, but not in that position where he should be pitching out of the bullpen in a big game like they was against Atlanta. So just some questionable decisions from Buck. And, but that series is over. Maybe that was a little therapeutic for me to just talk about that for a couple minutes, get that out, some frustrations for all Mets fans, but it's over now. It's over. They're on to Friday, and they're on to this Mets and Padres wildcard series. Breaking down this series, I want to look at it from the pitching side, from the hitting side, from the bullpen as well, all sorts of different angles into this series. I think having all 3 games at home, that's going to help you a lot. That's definitely going to help the Mets a lot. I think Citi Field will be rocking. First home game, first playoff game since 2016, so there's going to be a lot of fans at this game. It's definitely going to sell out, and I think that crowd's really going to create an edge for the New York Mets. And looking at the Padres in San Diego, they've really struggled since the trade deadline. After they added Juan Soto, after they added Josh Bell, Josh Hader, I think this is honestly a very beatable team. They definitely struggled at times. They picked things up a little bit in September, but overall kind of limping a little bit into October and into the playoffs, securing one of those wild card positions. And I want to break down the pitching matchups of course, it's going to be Max Scherzer and Yu Darvish game one. That's what all signs are pointing towards. Originally, thoughts were on Jacob deGrom going game one, but it looks like it's going to be Scherzer and Darvish. And Yu Darvish has been very, very good against the Mets. 5-0, 2.56 ERA against the Mets in his career. And on the other side of things, you have Scherzer, who really struggled in his last start against Atlanta. The Mets actually have trouble winning when Scherzer and DeGrom starts, which is obviously a huge concern because those guys are going to have to be dominant. They're going to have to win just about every game that those guys pitch in the postseason. But when you look at Scherzer and you look at his last start against Atlanta, there's just some missed spots, prone to that home run ball, giving up a couple homers to the Braves. But luckily, I would say for the Mets and for Scherzer, the Padres, they're 21st in the league in home runs. So they don't hit the home run ball quite like the Atlanta Braves do, one of the top teams in all of baseball at hitting home runs. So maybe that helps Scherzer out a little bit. After game one, Scherzer and Darvish, things get a little bit different. I think it kind of depends on what happens in game one. Buck's going to play a similar, strategy that he played actually with the Yankees in the 90s, in the fact that if the Mets win game one, it's going to be most likely Chris Bassett in game two. And then if they lose game two, they go to DeGrom in game three. However, if the Mets lose that Scherzer start in game one, on Saturday, game two, they're going to go most likely to Jacob deGrom because it'll be an elimination game, a must-win game. But ideally, obviously, the Mets want to save Jacob deGrom for the division series before that game one against the Dodgers. So we'll see what they do from the pitching side of things. But looking at the Padres and their starters, it's not just Yu Darvish. It's Joe Musgrove. It's Snell right there. There's others there as well. But in a three-game set, in a three-game series, which is very unique, obviously, to the wild card, it plays right into the strengths of the New York Mets. It plays right into the strengths of those three guys that they trust in big spots. And like I said, obviously, they didn't deliver in those big spots against Atlanta, but you're going to keep running those guys out there, deGrom and Scherzer and Chris Bassett. Those are your guys. You need them to pitch better. If they don't, the Mets are not going to go anywhere. The Mets will not get past San Diego. If they do, this team is going to be scary to face in the postseason, and it's going to start with them. Looking at the offensive side of things for both sides, the Mets, they're not going to have Marte. And obviously, that's a huge loss. I mentioned a little bit earlier in that Braves series, it was very evident. The lineup just isn't as deep with him, without him in the lineup. And it's going to kind of the Mets are going to have to rely on guys like Jeff McNeil. Jeff McNeil just won the batting title in the National League as I'm recording this here on Wednesday. Eduardo Escobar as well. He's hitting .325. He's got 8 homers in his last 30 games. Those two guys are going to have to step up. They're not only going to have to hit, they're going to have to hit with runners in scoring position. And overall, I think the Mets offensively really need to get back to something that they've done all year long, something they didn't do in that series against Atlanta. That's working counts. That's forcing pitchers out of the game early. That's hitting with runners in scoring position. This team is really not about power. You have guys like Pete Alonso that can hit the home run ball. But overall, as a lineup, you need to create no easy outs. You can't let a Padres pitcher, or what the Braves did and what their pitchers did over the weekend, you can't let them get in a groove. You can't let them settle in, and another big thing as well, and I think it's especially important, not only with this lineup, but also in the playoffs as a whole, is you have to capitalize in early situations with runners on base to avoid letting teams and avoid letting pitchers settle in. The Mets had numerous opportunities. I think it was Friday and Sunday, maybe even Saturday as well. Runners on base early on in the first, innings 1 through 3, and they get just maybe 1 run out of it, maybe, at the most 2 runs out of it. But for the most part, in those spots, getting 1 run out of it is not enough. You really have to capitalize early, first time through the order. That's sometimes when these pitchers are the most vulnerable. You might see that with Yu Darvish here on Friday night in Game 1. He's had a lot of success against the Mets. Don't let him get into a groove. Don't let him settle down. Get to him right away. And when you have the opportunity, you have to hit with runners in scoring position in those big at-bats. That's going to be definitely a key for the Mets offense. And, before I kind of give a prediction of what I think this series is going to turn out to be, I want to look at the bullpen, which is obviously has been a problem for the Mets outside of a guy named Edwin Diaz. And it's going to be, an exciting closer matchup between Josh Hader and Edwin Diaz. Obviously, Hader, in August when he first started with the Padres was terrible. He had a 19 ERA, 19 ERA in the month of August, so really struggled out of the gate. But he settled in September. His ERA is down to 1. His ERA in September was 1, so he's lowering that ERA with San Diego. But the advantage still is very clearly in the pitching hand of Edwin Diaz. With the unbelievable year he's had, he's been absolutely lights out. I expect the same in the postseason, especially at home with those trumpets blaring. Everybody's going to be on their feet. That's very tough. He hasn't really had a save opportunity in a long time. He hasn't pitched. There haven't been a lot of close games in September for the Mets, so you got to hope that he's getting the ball late in the game for the Mets. But outside of that, there's question marks. I think that, I've been critical of what Buck's done with the bullpen. Tyler McGill in that spot on Friday against the Braves, not a great decision. Even going to Joely Rodriguez on Sunday against the Braves, although he's pitched well against them. I think there's a couple guys you can really trust in that pen. It's Seth Lugo, Adam Ottavino, and Edwin Diaz. And outside of that, I don't think Buck should be going to many other arms in those places because, listen, this is the postseason. You don't need to worry about, okay, it's been 2 days, this guy's got to get a day off. No, these relievers should be pitching just about every day. Seth Lugo and Adam Ottavino are going to be pitching just about every day for this team. Obviously, those aren't maybe the biggest names that you want to see in those big spots, especially maybe in the 8th inning of a playoff game, but they have had success overall on the season for the Mets bullpen, and those are the guys that you have to ride with to get between your starter and Edwin Diaz in the 9th. And overall, I think Scherzer is going to come out of the pen as well. He's going to be important for the New York Mets also out of the pen, not only starting games, I think, especially into the divisional series and, potentially into a championship series, if those are options. Max Scherzer is going to be pitching a lot, much more than just a start every, 2 or 3 games, whatever it may be. But it's going to be an exciting series. It's going to be a fun series. And I want to plead to Mets fans, get excited about this. Obviously the season did not end the way that the Mets wanted it to, but it's playoff baseball. It's at Citi Field, and it's going to be an unbelievable and awesome 3-game series against a very good Padres team. It's not about thinking about the Dodgers in the division series. It's right now about these 3 games this coming weekend, and I'm super excited to cover it with WFUV Sports. But I think signing off here on a Mets and Padres wild card preview, I'm Sam Davis with WFUV Sports.